Fernando Alonso stood in front of the pit wall. He had just removed his helmet, but the lines on his face still carried the pressure of the qualifying session. Everything was quiet in the McLaren garage, at least from the outside. But inside, the silence was louder than ever. Lewis Hamilton was still in his car. The radio was silent. Times were spinning on the screens. But the team's eyes were on something else, on Alonso's move. That season had started differently. Alonso had come to McLaren as a double world champion. He was supposed to be the team leader, the points machine, the monument of consistency. Hamilton was a rookie, a beginner. He would learn, but nobody had calculated how fast Hamilton could learn. Victory in Canada. Victory again in America. Alonso's patience was being tested not from the track, but from inside the garage. And that test exploded during Hungary qualifying. The clock was ticking at the pit wall. Time was limited. The final run was about to begin. Alonso entered the pits. Mechanics were working on the car. Then the radio call came. "Box now, Fernando. Push, push." But Alonso waited and waited. Behind him stood Lewis Hamilton. He was cued for the final run. But Alonso didn't move. 5 seconds passed. 10 seconds. Then he slowly left the pits. Hamilton couldn't make that lap. Alonso's pole time appeared on the team screen. The garage was silent, but everyone understood. This wasn't a mistake. This was a message. At the press conference, when Hamilton was asked, he simply said, "The team had a plan, but some didn't stick to the plan." Alonso answered with fewer words. "I just drove my lap." Team principal Ron Dennis didn't make a decision that day. But as the season progressed, it was clear. McLaren had turned from a team into a battlefield. 2 fast men, 2 different backgrounds, but the same goal. At Monza, spectators whistled. At Spa, radios went silent. And the tension within the team was reflected in the points table. Hamilton and Alonso were more enemies than teammates. When the season finale came, McLaren had lost everything. Kimi Räikkönen won the championship. But nobody who watched that season talked about Ferrari's victory. Because 2007 was a turning point in F1 history. Because that year proved that a team couldn't carry 2 superstars. Years later, Alonso would say, "My rival wasn't on track. He was in the same garage." And Hamilton would speak even more simply, "I learned a lot that year." Most of all, that trust can be lost before the race. This wasn't contact. This wasn't a spin. This was the high-speed version of an ego war. And in the end, not even one of them won. But everyone lost something. And that season in McLaren history is still remembered with this question: can 2 champions fit in one team? The next day in Hungary, grid positions were set. Alonso on pole position, Hamilton in second. But at the team meeting, nobody could look each other in the eye. Ron Dennis's face was stone cold. Mechanics worked silently, as if at a funeral. At the McLaren factory, strategist Andy Latham stood in front of the whiteboard, explaining the race strategy for both drivers. But everyone in the room was thinking the same thing. This wasn't just a race anymore. This was the moment a team's soul was being torn apart. On race morning, Alonso stood alone at the pit wall. Normally, teammates and mechanics would gather around him. Now it was as if an invisible wall had been built. He was muttering to himself in Spanish, "Esto no es lo que esperaba." This is not what I expected. Hamilton had a different strategy. He gave diplomatic answers to every journalist's question. He smiled, talked about team spirit. But the determination in his eyes told a different story. This wasn't just a 22-year-old rookie. This was a predator, ready to send a message to the whole world. When the race started, the atmosphere at Hungary's Hungaroring had electrified. Alonso took a perfect start. Hamilton followed closely in second place. In the first 10 laps, the two McLarens gave hints of what kind of show they would put on throughout the race. But the real drama happened during pit stops. While the team thought the two drivers were racing with different strategies, in reality, the two drivers were settling scores between themselves. Alonso entered the first stop early. Hamilton didn't wait and quickly came to the pit wall. But there was no coordination among the mechanics. It was as if two different teams were working in the same garage. Hamilton's car had moved ahead of Alonso. Although overtaking was difficult in Hungaroring's narrow corners, Hamilton continued to apply pressure. Alonso shouted on the radio to the team, "What are you doing?" What was the plan? Andy Latham's voice was heard on the team radio. "Fernando, stay calm, follow the plan." But Alonso's response melted the ice. Which plan? For Lewis or for me? The rest of the race turned into a psychological war between the two drivers. Alonso tried every maneuver to overtake Hamilton, but the young Englishman masterfully defended his position. On the final lap, when the two McLarens crossed the finish line, Hamilton came in a second ahead. At the podium ceremony, Alonso didn't raise the champagne bottle. He barely smiled in the team photo. Hamilton was enjoying his victory, but his look at Alonso was different. He now respected him, but at the same time, he wasn't afraid to fight against him. At the post-race press conference, journalists dropped the bomb. A British journalist asked Alonso, "Fernando, did the tension between you and your teammate affect the race?" Alonso experienced a long silence. Then very calmly he replied, "I always try to do the best for McLaren. But sometimes the team doesn't know which driver is more important." Hamilton's answer was more diplomatic. "Fernando is a great driver. I'm learning a lot from him. We're strong as a team." But everyone in the room could feel the tension underlying these words. In the following races of the season, things became even more complicated. At the Italian Grand Prix, radio wars were waged between Alonso and Hamilton. In Belgium, there was competition between the two drivers, even off the track. Ron Dennis constantly emphasized team spirit in team meetings. But it was clear he was facing a situation he couldn't control either. Former McLaren driver Mika Häkkinen approached Ron Dennis in the paddock and said, "Ron, you're trying to manage both of them. But if one wants it more than the other, you'll have to make a choice." At the Turkish Grand Prix, the championship race reached a critical stage. Kimi Räikkönen was leading the points table with Ferrari. Both Alonso and Hamilton mathematically maintained their championship chances. But the division within the team prevented the two drivers from supporting each other. At the pre-race strategy meeting, Hamilton and Alonso sat at the same table, but never spoke. They just listened to the strategist's words, took notes, but avoided making eye contact with each other. Even the team mechanics were aware of this. Former McLaren mechanic John Peterson would say years later, "During that period, it was like we were working for two separate teams. One car was Fernando's, the other was Lewis's, but both had the same goal, to beat the other." In the Turkish race, while Alonso and Hamilton battled at the front, Räikkönen quietly collected points. While both focused on each other, the Finnish driver, their real rival, came to an ideal position for the championship. After the race, there was silence in the McLaren garage. Technical director Pat Fry, looking at the data reports in his hand, was examining the sector times of both drivers. Both were only a few tenths of seconds faster than each other. But this small difference was the result of a massive ego war. When the Chinese Grand Prix arrived, the championship fate was still uncertain. But at McLaren, everyone had now accepted. The war between the two drivers had destroyed the team's championship chances. At the pre-race press conference, when Fernando Alonso was asked about the championship, he gave an unexpected answer. To win the championship, sometimes you need to cooperate with your teammate, but sometimes your teammate becomes your biggest rival. Hamilton took the microphone after these words. Every driver wants to win. Both Fernando and I do, but the team always comes first. But the tension experienced on the team radio showed how empty these words were. In China, the race took place in the rain. Alonso delivered a tremendous performance on the wet track, but Hamilton made very risky moves to prove himself. In the end, both drivers lost points. Raikkonen, meanwhile, took a big step toward the championship with a cool-headed race. After the race, Ron Dennis stood alone at the McLaren pit wall. This man, who had worked at McLaren for about 20 years, had never looked so tired. His team had one of the fastest cars of the season, technologically. But the war between the drivers had nullified all advantages. When the season finale Brazilian Grand Prix arrived, mathematically 3 drivers were still fighting for the championship: Raikkonen, Alonso, and Hamilton. But everyone knew that if McLaren's 2 drivers had cooperated with each other, the championship would have been decided long ago. At Interlagos, in the final practice session, there was only 0.003 of a second difference between Alonso and Hamilton's sector times. Technically, both were in perfect position for the championship, but psychologically, both were worn out. The Brazilian race became a race that summarized all the drama of the 2007 season. Alonso took a perfect start. Hamilton aggressively moved up to second place. But the real drama happened in the middle of the race. When Hamilton experienced gearbox problems, the timing couldn't be perfect. Alonso asked on the team radio, "Does Lewis have a problem?" The team said, "Focus on him, Fernando. Just focus on your own race." But the tone in Alonso's voice was unclear whether it was sadness or satisfaction. In the final laps of the race, Raikkonen was in first place. Alonso was second, while Hamilton was in 7th position, the best result he could achieve with points. When the checkered flag waved, Raikkonen had lifted the championship trophy. Alonso finished second, Hamilton third in the overall standings. But the real loser was McLaren. At the podium ceremony, while Alonso raised the champagne bottle, Hamilton stood alone at the pit wall. Ron Dennis stood between the 2 drivers, equidistant from both. But the expression on his face was completely that of a man who had accepted defeat. At the end of the season, the final meeting was held at the McLaren factory. The entire team came together. Ron Dennis stood up and said, "This season, we had one of the fastest cars, technically. We raced with 2 world-class drivers, but we lost the championship. Because without team spirit, nothing is enough." Alonso sat in the back row of the meeting room. Hamilton was in the front row. Both were listening to the same words, but they never looked at each other. After the meeting, Alonso and Hamilton met in the parking lot. For the first time in months, both encountered each other without helmets and racing suits, in civilian clothes. Alonso approached Hamilton. "Lewis," he said, "you're a good driver, but this year, we both lost." Hamilton paused for a moment. Then he replied, "Fernando, you were my teacher, but sometimes the student wants to surpass the teacher." Both smiled. For the first time, they shook hands sincerely, but both knew this story wouldn't end here. A few weeks later, Alonso announced he would leave McLaren. Hamilton would stay with the team. At the press conference, Alonso said, "McLaren is a great team, but sometimes having 2 champions in one team is difficult." Ron Dennis interpreted Alonso's departure as follows: "Fernando is a great driver, but Lewis is McLaren's future." In the 2008 season, Hamilton won the championship with McLaren. Alonso opened a new page at Ferrari, but the shadow of the 2007 season followed both of them. Years later, Alonso would say, 2007 was the hardest season for me, because my rival was also off the track. But at the same time, that season taught me a lot. To win, it's not enough to just be fast. You also need to be in harmony with the team. Hamilton would say, Fernando taught me a lot, not just driving, but also thinking like a champion. Today, they are still among the legends of F1. Alonso is still racing at 41. Hamilton became a 7-time world champion. But both acknowledge the same thing. The 2007 season was the turning point of their careers, because that season showed how difficult it is to have two superstars together in one team. But at the same time, that season made both of them stronger drivers. McLaren remembers the 2007 season as the season they lost. But at the same time, that season left its mark on the team's history. Because that season, a team had to learn how to manage two champions at the same time. And today, when we look at Formula One history, the 2007 season is remembered not only as Raikkonen's championship year, but also as the year that shaped Alonso and Hamilton's careers. Because that season wasn't just a race. That season was the moment we witnessed the birth of two legends. But at the same time, that season also showed how a team could lose due to the war within itself. And that question is still valid. Can two champions fit in one team? The answer is still being debated in the F1 paddock. But one thing is certain. The legacy of the 2007 season continues even today. Epilogue. One evening, in Monaco, Alonso and Hamilton happened to be eating at the same restaurant. 15 years had passed between them. Both were sitting at different tables, but they met at the restaurant's exit. "Hello, Lewis," said Alonso. "Hello, Fernando," said Hamilton. For a moment, both smiled, and Hamilton said, "You know, if we lived the 2007 season again, we would do the same things again." Alonso smiled. Of course, because we were both born to win, and both knew what that season had made them. Because sometimes your biggest rival makes you your strongest self.